thing to bring the people of Judah out of the exile experience. It was quite another to get the exile experience out of them. Long after the first excited returnees came back to Jerusalem and its environs, a lingering sense of disconnectedness and alienation remained within them. Now, when people are struggling to rediscover who they really are, that's the time when stories become especially important. None of us can be secure in our identity if we don't know our own story and the story of our people. So the chronicler digs deep into the stories of Judah, reminding these disoriented returnees of their roots, of their great leaders of the past, and in so doing helps them to know who they are as God's partner people. Leslie Allen shows how the chronicler does this for them.
The author of Chronicles, whom we call the chronicler, appears to have lived toward the end of the Persian period of ancient Near Eastern history, in the first half of the 4th century BC. In the Old Testament, his work has suffered from being placed after the books of Samuel and Kings, as if it were some pale shadow of them. In the Hebrew Bible, however, it stands right at the end as an impressive climax to guide God's people into the future. Chronicles needs that canonical distance from Samuel and Kings to represent its later time frame and different perspective. The chronicler used the history of the old Judean monarchy to provide spiritual help for his contemporaries living in the little province of Judah after the exile. He had a theological and pastoral agenda that he communicated through the medium of history writing. He selected and adapted material from the earlier books of Samuel and Kings, but his focus was quite different. Samuel and Kings were part of an epic work that starts with Joshua and tries to answer the question, why did the exile happen? A different question was on the chronicler's heart, how do we get full restoration from exile? Of course, a return from exile had begun 2 centuries earlier, under Cyrus, the first Persian emperor. Yet the post-exilic community, though conscious of its relative blessings, was acutely aware that its restoration so far fell short of the glorious promises given in the prophetic books. The Judeans were languishing in a virtual exile and craved fullness of salvation. As Psalm 126 illustrates, restore our fortunes, O Lord, and with its wish that those who now sow in tears may eventually reap with shouts of joy. The chronicler evidently prized 3 Old Testament passages that dealt with the issues of exile and return, and he gleaned from them the distinctive vocabulary he used in handling the problem of a continuing kind of exile. The first passage, taken from the Torah, or Mosaic Law, was Leviticus 26, 34 through 45, which looks beyond exile to the return to the Promised Land. The author of Chronicles derived from it his characteristic phrase for the cause of exile, to practice unfaithfulness, in the sense of breaking God's Torah. For instance, 1 Chronicles 9:1, Judah was taken into exile in Babylon because of their unfaithfulness. The chronicler also found in Leviticus 26 one of his favorite terms for the means of restoration, to be humbled or humble oneself before God. One place the chronicler used the term was in the classic recipe for spiritual restoration. If my people who are called by my name humble themselves, pray, seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, says God, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. Another text that underlies Chronicles was taken from the prophets, Jeremiah 29, 10 through 19. It too deals with literal exile and restoration, and so provided a key for dealing with the problem of a sort of lingering exile. This Jeremiah passage is the source of the promise of seeking and finding God that the chronicler incorporated into his stories. If you seek him, he will be found by you. The Jeremiah passage supplies the chronicler's favorite spiritual word, seek, that he used of repentant return to God and of prescribed worship and way of life. The third passage about exile and return that evidently appealed to the chronicler was also from the prophets, Ezekiel 18. In that chapter, Ezekiel made an appeal to the exiles in Babylon to repent and so be allowed to return to the land. Ezekiel grounded his appeal in a sequence of good and bad generations, and also of generations that changed in midstream, from good to bad and from bad to good. The passage provided structural models for the chronicler's royal narratives of the kingdom of Judah after Solomon. From 2 Chronicles 10 onward, we find a series of kings occupying the throne of Judah who were variously good, bad, initially good and turning bad, or initially bad and becoming good. The chronicler's challenging teaching of immediate retribution also comes from Ezekiel. For Ezekiel, each generation begins again with God. In turn, the chronicler regarded members of each generation as controlling their own destiny and free to start again for or against God. God's grace made possible a break from the oppressive past that haunted each post-exilic generation, while God's providential judgment was liable to fall on those who stubbornly held to the past. The chronicler had two turns at writing his history. The first is in 1 Chronicles 1 through 9, and largely uses genealogy as its medium. It portrays Israel as God's chosen people by focusing on the patriarch Jacob, or Israel, and his 12 sons, who founded the 12 tribes of Israel. It presents pre-exilic genealogies of each of the tribes, and moves to the exile of the northern tribes and the southern tribes, and then to the return of the mainly southern tribes. The genealogical material stresses the people's traditional identity as 12 tribes, rather than simply the 3 or 4 southern ones. It issues an ecumenical challenge to self-contained Judah to overcome prejudice and invite tribespeople in the north to worship with them in Jerusalem. The chronicler's presentation places the religious tribe of Levi in the middle of his account as a symbol of the central role of the temple for contemporary Judah. The priest Aaron was of the tribe of Levi. In the genealogy of the tribe of Judah, special importance is attached to the line of David, which is made to run far beyond pre-exilic times. The chronicler develops these 3 themes of communal inclusivity, the temple, and the role of the Davidic dynasty in his second presentation of Judah's past history, from 1 Chronicles 10 to the end of 2 Chronicles. After a brief look at King Saul, he concentrates on the reigns of David and Solomon, and then briefly traces the history of southern kings up to the exile, before closing with an opportunity to return to the land. The reigns of Saul and David are used as symbols of exile and restoration. In 1 Chronicles 10, Saul is unfaithful, and his subjects are scattered from their homes. However, in 11, 1 through 9, David is raised up as the new king of a united people and comes to live in Jerusalem, bringing his people back from a spiritual exile. The focus in the reigns of David and Solomon is the building of the temple and God's gift of a new permanent dynasty that affected for good the relationship between God and the people. God's covenant with David and its continuing under Solomon constituted for the chronicler a theological privilege for Israel to enjoy thereafter. In his prayer at the dedication of the temple, Solomon mentions God's steadfast love for David. The people respond by praising God as one whose steadfast love endures forever. This formula of praise is associated with the Mosaic covenant, and its use shows the merging of the Mosaic and Davidic covenants. Under David and Solomon, a new era of grace was offered through the temple as a place of prayer for divine grace, a place where God gives second chances. God promised Solomon, "If my people pray, Then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. This era goes beyond the Mosaic covenant, which was marked by the failure of God's people to keep the covenant. Yet there was continuity with the old era. The religious and moral standards of the Mosaic Torah were still obligatory. The chronicler incorporated each of the Torah-based festivals into his royal stories and emphasized the joy of worship. However, the tabernacle in the Torah was replaced by Solomon's temple, now represented by the second post-exilic temple for the chronicler's first readers. And for those who disobeyed Torah and repented, there was a way back to God, even for members of the northern tribes, according to 2 Chronicles 30. There, Hezekiah invites northerners to celebrate the Passover at the Jerusalem temple. After the once-and-for-all theological privilege established under David and Solomon, a challenging responsibility was laid on kings and commoners to stay within the bounds of law and grace, to trust and obey God, and to repent whenever necessary. The permanence of the Davidic covenant meant that it had continuing spiritual value for the people of God. It also implied the eventual restoration of the dynasty, which one suspects was a distant item on the chronicler's calendar. The dynasty would be restored in God's good time and was separate from the blessings each generation might expect to inherit from the Davidic covenant, blessings that could coexist for now with Persian rule. Chronicles is inspirational literature. The chronicler had a pastor's heart and a teacher's head, and his concern for his constituency surfaces throughout. He had only a few tunes in his spiritual repertoire, and he played them over and over again in order to encourage and challenge his readers.
Maybe we need to hear just a few tunes too, that we're part of a story being told by God, a story that has its beginnings way before even the chronicler wrote, and continues to this day.